Hello and welcome to our Black History Month event for the School of Cultural Studies and Humanities at Leeds Beckett. We're absolutely delighted to be joined by the multi-award-winning artist Yinka Shonibare. So welcome Yinka and welcome all. Now, I'm a lecturer in post-colonial literature at Leeds Beckett University. And just before I introduce Yinka, I want to remind you all that there are opportunities to submit questions for Yinka at the end of the session. So to do this, you submit to slido.com and then you put the event code, which is YS BHM, and then type your question. And my esteemed and dear colleague Rachel Rich will be putting those questions to Yinka at the end of my conversation with him. So without further ado, let me tell you a little bit about Yinka. So Yinka studied fine art at the Byam School of Art in London, and he received his MFA from Goldsmith University in 1991. His interdisciplinary practice uses references to Western art history and literature to question the validity of contemporary cultural and national identities within the context of globalization. By examining race, class, and a construction of cultural identity, his works comment on the tangled interrelationships between Africa and Europe and their respective economic and political histories. Now, Yinka has been the recipient of too many prizes and awards to name them all, but highlights are the Turner Prize nomination in 2004 and his first public art commission, which was Nelson's Ship in a Bottle, which was displayed on the 4th plinth in Trafalgar Square in 2010. This was followed in 2013 by a CBE and the election to the Royal Academy. Now, this year, Yinka was awarded the prestigious Whitechapel Gallery Icon Award. A major retrospective of his work opened at the Museum de Moderne in Salzburg in Austria in May. And he's also coordinating the Royal Academy's summer exhibition in London, which opened in September. I recently went to London and the first thing I saw on a tube was beautiful, huge posters advertising this incredible collection. So Yinka's works are in notable museum collections internationally, including the Tate Collection and the Victoria and Albert Museum and many more. Now, as many of you know, Yinka will be creating a sculpture in the new Air Park development in Leeds, down by the River Aire. And this will be a sculpture garden to commemorate the life of David Olawale, a Nigerian migrant who was tragically hounded to his death by 2 West Yorkshire police officers in 1969. Now, this sculpture will be launched in 2023 as part of the Leeds City of Culture celebrations. I'm the co-chair of the David Olawale Memorial Association, and we're thrilled to be working with Yinka. Now, we'll talk a bit more about David Olawale and Yinka's response to David towards the end of our conversation. But for now, I just want to talk to Yinka about some of his other incredible work. Welcome, Yinka.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Now, we've got some wonderful slides of your work here to show our audience. And the slide that we have up is of Double Dutch. Now, this really leads us into the conversation about your use of African fabrics, Yinka, which I find absolutely fascinating. And in particular, you use the Dutch wax batik fabric. Now, could you tell us a little bit more about why you use this particular fabric in your work in many different ways, and also what kind of commentary it might have on how Africa is perceived by the West?
Okay, so I'll just kind of paint a picture for you here. So if I was a young African artist at art school in London. And, I grew up in Nigeria and then came to the UK. But the background is such that, when I was young, my father used to take, Time magazine, Newsweek. So, we were always very familiar with global current affairs. But when I moved back to London, even though I had been born in London, I moved back. And when I moved back to London, I realized that if you're a Black person, there are always questions about your identity. So I was, in fact, making work about global issues, what was going on in Russia at the time, perestroika. I felt that I was entitled to make work about anything, really. And one of my tutors said to me, well, you're of African origin, aren't you? Why aren't you producing authentic African art? And so in my head, I thought, well, what does that mean for a contemporary African who grew up, watching Sesame Street on TV and, and also reading both African and English literature? And so I realized that actually the question of authenticity is something that I would have to address in my work. And so I went to a market in London, in Brixton Market, and I started asking them about the fabrics in the fabric shop. I had imagined the fabrics were, quote unquote, authentic African textiles. I didn't realize that the fabrics were Indonesian inspired fabric produced by the Dutch and then sold to the West African market. Of course, the fabrics are now made in Africa and also in China. But the origins, so I found the colonial origins very interesting, a relationship between Indonesia and Holland. And so the fabrics then became a metaphor for the relationship between Africa and Europe. And of course, the fabrics also became a sign of African empowerment and independence. So that then, Africans have also taken on the fabrics and made the fabrics, their own. But it's so, and then I had trained, in art history, and I was trained as a painter. I then decided to start to interrogate, art itself, to swap canvas for the fabrics. And so that's the kind of origin of this work.
Okay, thank you, Yinka. And it's fascinating what you say about this idea of what is authentic. And are you, in a sense, saying that this hybridity, it is only hybridity which is authentic, that we have to embrace the hybrid nature of our identities and our cultures, and that perhaps is the only authenticity we will find?
Absolutely, you're right. I think that it's somewhat essentialist to put people in singular boxes. And I'm afraid that's actually the origin of fascism. When you, when you essentialize and you put people in fixed boxes, the kind of lives we live now, I imagine, we live fluid lives and we have varied experiences. And after all, the nation state is a relatively modern phenomenon. So, so I don't subscribe to the idea or the notion of pure blood. I think that we have to kind of embrace that hybridity and understand that, we live in a society where most of our identities anyway do tend to be hyphenated identities. I don't know if you know what I mean by that.
Yes, yeah, carry on.
British, Nigerian, Italian, American, and so on.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And and I was interested also in the title of this work, Double Dutch. Is this a commentary on that, what might confuse people if they cannot perhaps celebrate that sense of hybridity? I just wondered if you'd comment on the naming of this piece.
Yes, so I mean, it's sort of partly a joke as well. If people don't actually understand foreigners, they say they're speaking double Dutch. And also Dutch wax, the fabrics are called Dutch wax. So, so it's a combination of all of those things.
Now, I wondered, Yinka, if we could look at your amazing series of photos for Diary of a Victorian Dandy. And these are fascinating photos, which were on the London Underground, I believe, as well as being exhibited in an art gallery. Yeah, first of all, well, you tell us a little bit about these, because I have some questions about them.
Okay, so when I was working in the 90s, you know, there were quite a few Black artists working, but the artists were not necessarily really visible, or not particularly in the mainstream. And then within my own art history, when I looked at images of Hogarth or many of the historical 18th century works, the artists, if there was an image of a Black person in those paintings, the Black person would be in some kind of subservient role, you know, either a cute little child or a valet, and I decided that I wanted to take control of the representation of my own body within the production of imagery. And I also wanted to take the works outside of a gallery. So in effect, this series, I mean, they're my first public works of art. So I have them as huge posters on the London Underground. And you can imagine then, you know, art wasn't often shown on the London Underground at that time. Now, you know, that's something that happens often. So that had a huge, you know, huge impact. People wondered who this character was, but the series is actually based on Hogarth's Rake's Progress. And so, you know, you start with the life of the dandy. You know, he's got a leisurely lifestyle, wakes up in the morning, plays a game, talks to his friends, and then there's the kind of, you know, debauchery at the end. But there's no kind of moral comeback, you know, there's no, but I did that deliberately to just change how people read Black people within image making. And you know, yeah, so that's and of course, because of the colonial era, and the height of colonialism in Africa was the Victorian era. And so, and I've often also used Victorian imagery in my work as well, because that would have been the least expected thing, you know, from an artist of African origin. But of course, without Europe, there is no Africa, in the sense that, you know, actually, Africa, again, another relatively modern concept, because, you know, people talk about all of the people in Africa, but Africa is actually not a country. And, you know, and all of the different sections in different areas were mostly joined together and then divided up by Europe. And so as we go on, we will see Scramble for Africa when the countries, you know, when the African countries were divided. So can we go to the next slides after Diary of a Victorian Dandy? Okay, so this is the swing. Can we go to the next one, maybe? Okay, I'll come back to that. If we go back again one. Okay, so I think that, so this is the swing after Fragona. And again, looking at the history of art has always played a strong role in my work. And of course, I talked about Hogarth earlier. And then this is a Fragona painting. It's a depiction of a woman being pushed on the swing by a priest. And it's a very well-known painting, but it's also a painting of the kind of opulent lifestyles of the aristocracy in Paris at the time. And of course, we know that that kind of opulence was only possible because, unfortunately, certain people were enslaved, and there was the labor that kind of enabled that level of opulence. And so, and we also know that the French Revolution happened and the aristocracy were guillotined. So, you know, as a kind of, I guess as a joke, I used to guillotine the head of my figures, you know, the earlier figures. So that's why she's headless. And also, if you look closely at that sculpture, this is actually in the collection of the Tate Gallery. It's not on display at the moment, I don't think, but on close inspection, you will find that there is the Chanel logo on the dress there. And so it's just a comment about the disparity of wealth, you know, between you know, the rich and poor people. Okay, if we go to the next one. Or did you want to ask me a question about it?
Well, I was just going to say, Yinka, I love the way that you are, you know, inserting the African people into these scenes of leisure, as you say, and you know, as you pointed out, Black people in British colonies would not have been living in this way, many of them. But I also wanted to ask if you're, by inserting that African presence into quite a classical, canonical European art form, you're also making a point about the art itself and the relationships between European and African art.
Yes, I mean, I think that it's really about taking control of your own representation or the narrative of representation. You know, and I was highly influenced by the work of Roland Barthes, you know, mythologies. And, you know, so semiotics is something that I'm very interested in. I'm very interested in representation, how we represent things and what we use to represent those things. And you know, the language of representation is the language that creates stereotypes, if you like. And so what I'm doing with some of my work is kind of taking control of representation and the means by which we represent things.
Yes.
So that's what I meant by semiotics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're sort of you're you know, you're bending the rules in a sense and playing with people's expectations, you know, tricking them into challenging their perceived ideas.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And then this is a piece I had at Documenta. Again, you know, parodying the life of the aristocracy when they did the Grand Tour. And the Grand Tour was about mostly the aristocracy traveling around Europe, you know, around sort of 18th century, a way to learn about culture. People would go to Venice, they would go to Rome. But then when I was also reading further about that, I was reading about the kind of, first of all, local exploitation of the lower classes, and also, you know, debauchery really was a kind of pretext for culture. So, you know, and so in a way, I'd like to approach those serious issues about class disparity and discrimination through a vehicle of parody, if you like, and also not necessarily always literal. You know, it can also take kind of surreal manifestations as well.
Yes. It feels that in this piece there's something more brutal and a less playful statement on aristocratic life than the pieces that we've seen before. You know, that you are deeply angered by this the Grand Tour and reality of the trip.
Well, yes, but also there's something kind of frivolous as well as totally dark, because they're headless as well. You know, so there's that kind of macabre element about it, but it's not necessarily, not always overt, because you can celebrate the you know, the costumes and the beauty of the costumes and the shoes and all of those things. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so can we go to the next one, please? Okay, so this is what I started to talk about a little bit earlier, which is Scramble for Africa. And we know that many of the African countries, we know that they were kind of artificially created. There was a Berlin Conference in which the 14 European nations came around the table and divided Africa up amongst themselves without necessarily asking the people if they wanted to be in the same country. And unfortunately, the legacy of that is that many, you know, there's been lots of kind of civil wars. Many tribes were kind of pushed together into the same country. And, you know, a lot of countries are still trying to hold together as a nation, but some of those nations were artificially created by European countries. So, and it's important to understand, you know, that the present conflict in many of those countries are sometimes based on the historical factors. And that's kind of, so in a way, I see them as basically, you know, 14 headless men sitting around the table. Well, I would say brainless, as it were. They did not consult the people.
Yeah, this piece really fascinates me, Yinka, and I teach the history of this conference to my post-colonial students, and I'll definitely be using this as an illustration of it in future. And I was really interested in how, you know, as well as depicting that scramble for Africa and that dividing of Africa amongst the European powers like some kind of pie or cake, how you also link this piece to our contemporary context. And I know you've said in the past that it also is a comment on American imperialism and the need for the West, in the West, for resources such as oil. So I was wondering if you could just comment on the link to our contemporary context as well.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, in with regards to America and the bigger and also some bigger European nations, you know, Africa has always been used as a place to extract, you know, raw materials for the wealth of the West. And so, you know, it's always been, because it's a huge place, as you know, with many natural resources. And so all of the things that we use, from our batteries to our mobile phones in the contemporary context, most of those minerals have been sort of taken out of Africa, leaving, unfortunately, horrible environmental damage, including the search for oil and the cars the polluting vehicles that we drive, you know, but leaving those places. I mean, Nigeria is a good example. You know, leaving some of those places terribly polluted, and people can't fish anymore in those places. So that relationship is contributing terribly to the environmental damage that we're all concerned by now. So, you know, we are still experiencing some of the consequences of that overexploitation of Africa.
Absolutely, we are, and you call our attention to that. And I think that in the next slide that we have of your work, the British Library in Tate Modern, I think what's really interesting about this particular exhibition is that it also shows us how that exploitation of Africa is based on the production of knowledge and the control of knowledge from the West. And I've heard so many exuberant responses to this piece, people who have gone to visit it. What does it mean for you, the representation of the books in the African fabric?
Okay, so can we go to the next image? So yeah, that's it. So this installation piece actually, I started thinking about right at the beginning of the whole debate around Brexit. And, you know, xenophobia was rising. And I realized that actually, what is British culture? Now, British culture is made of people who came from many other places. And also those people are icons of British culture. So you can think about, you know, not necessarily the people directly, but their families or their ancestors came from elsewhere. So you can go from the Queen to Helen Mirren to, you know, and so many of those figures, you know, Tracy Emin, you know, so many have families who came from elsewhere. And so it's deliberately called the British Library, but on the spines of those books are the names of first and second generation immigrants to Britain who've made a significant contribution to Britain, including people who oppose immigration, like Nigel Farage and so on. And then on the computers there, you can write your own story and your own immigration story. And it's there's a website which is very interesting. You can read several people's immigration stories. And if you go to the British Library installation.com, and so the Tate actually monitor that website and they host it. But it's always a very interesting read. People whose families came here in this, you know, during the Second World War, to people who came here, you know, in recent years. And so they kind of tell you the story of their journey. But the work is immersive and it's really colorful. It's about 6,000 books. So it's a very impactful installation about an issue which is really kind of, you know, which concerns us all now. Yeah. So that's what the British Library is. And the Tate acquired the piece. So the piece is currently on display at Tate Modern.
And it's a real sort of living artwork where people are adding their own stories to it. Is that what is it that you enjoy about these public works of art, Yinka, where you have that sort of audience participation and reception to the work?
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, when you actually engage the public, the work just seems to have more dynamism about it. You know, it becomes a verb instead of a noun. You know, it's an active piece. And I enjoy that. I enjoy the kind of public access and participation. And, you know, from the time I did Diary of a Victorian Dandy to Nelson's Ship in a Bottle in Trafalgar Square, I realized that actually, you know, you can continue to have dialogue with the people who are kind of experiencing the work, rather than, you know, a piece in a small collection where, you know, very few people will engage with the work. I mean, you know, I do works for museums as well, but I kind of do both, you know, both public and, you know, museum pieces.
Yes, and perhaps we could look at your Nelson's Ship in a Bottle and the wind sculpture series, which I believe that the wind sculpture was inspired by Nelson's Ship in a Bottle. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Yes.
Okay, so can we go to the next image then? Yes. So there is a project called the Fourth Plinth in Trafalgar Square. Artists are invited to put works on the empty plinth. And so when I was invited, I wanted to do something that related to the square, to Trafalgar Square. There's Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square, and Admiral Nelson fought the Battle of Trafalgar against Napoleon and he won that battle. When Nelson won, Britain was also able to expand the empire, and Britain had freedom of the seas. And so my own Nigerian origins and living in the UK is indirectly connected to British trade and empire. And so I took the so Nelson won the Battle of Trafalgar in a ship known as HMS Victory. And so I reproduced HMS Victory and changed the sails to the textiles I use in my work, and then put it in a bottle, a giant bottle. And so the piece is called Nelson's Ship in a Bottle. And the work can now be seen outside the Maritime Museum in Greenwich, in London, the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. And so it was in Trafalgar Square for about 18 months. Mm-hmm. And then the experience of making the work, I mean, of course, the work is, it's magical, even though it's talking about a very serious issue. It's also playful. And that aspect of play is also very important because, you have all different audiences in Trafalgar Square. And so I like to sort of be able to engage more broadly with the public, even though the issue might be actually a very serious one. And yeah, so that's what that is.
And then your wind sculpture series, you have that same fabric. If we go to the next slide, which, and as I heard that you said that you had this notion of harnessing the wind, which I love. I love the idea that you're trying to harness the wind in sculptural form and freezing a moment in time. These are absolutely stunning sculptures. Could you just tell us a little bit about what inspired that idea of harnessing the wind?
Well, so migration, the wind has a lot to do with notions of migration and travel, and many migrants came by sea, and also the kind of Nelson's Ship in a Bottle, the African diaspora also has mostly been moved around by the wind, and so that's what that is. And also I wanted to, if you think about sculpture and traditional sculpture is usually kind of a sort of big volume. So what I'm doing here is literally sculpting nothing, sculpting wind, or attempting to sculpt wind, sculpting something that's not there. And the way to capture that is to capture the impression of wind. And so it's kind of dynamic, and in relation to public sculpture, it's something that's also colorful, but it's also made out of a hard material, which is fiberglass, but made to look, weightless and soft.
Yes.
And then, of course, it's not on a plinth. It's down at the level of people, so you don't have to look up at it.
Going along with that theme of migration and how the wind symbolizes migration, Yinka, I was wondering if we could just talk a little bit about David Olawale before we have questions from our audience. So what I wanted to ask you is really what it is about David Olawale's migration story, because David was a Nigerian migrant like yourself, and what it was about David's story that inspired you to work with the David Olawale Memorial Association and create a piece of work for us here in Leeds.
Well, I mean, for people who don't know the David Olawale story, David Olawale was a man who came from Nigeria, and he traveled in the 40s, and and he then subsequently ended up in jail because of the way he came to the UK, stowed away on a ship, and he was jailed. And then when he left jail, he did various odd jobs, and unfortunately he had an encounter with the police and was abused, and he ended up in jail again, and then developed mental health problems, and he was was homeless after I left the hospital, and he'd been in hospital for several years, and he was constantly taunted and harassed by the police until he was eventually, unfortunately, he was beaten up, and his body was found in the River Aire. And that was a kind of a terrible thing that happened to him, but all of it happened to him mostly because of his race. And that was a really shocking thing, when I found out about the story. And so when I was asked to make a memorial to him, I was, I felt honored to be asked to do that. And I also see David Olawale as a symbol of social justice. So it was not just a man that was bullied and then killed, but I saw him as a lesson for us to move to make the world a better place for people. And so it's a huge responsibility, one which I don't underestimate and I take very seriously. But at the same time, I don't want to produce something that will be divisive. I want to produce something that will bring people together. And, because I think that we can find ways to right the wrongs of the past, and we don't need to repeat those wrongs. So it's very important for us to remember the things that happened, so that we can find a better way forward. So I'm hoping that the sculpture that I'm working on will bring people together. The sculpture is going to be not so far from River Aire, and it's going to be in a new park that's being created in Leeds. And so I hope it's it's a meeting point of imagination, reconciliation, and also a place to foster peace.
Oh, but it's wonderful to hear you talking about the sculpture in that way, and we at the David Olawale Memorial Association obviously feel that our vision and your vision are so totally aligned, and the idea of it being, as you say, symbolic of social justice. And there is a tension there, isn't there, Yinka, between telling and reflecting on David's dark and tragic story and all the intersectional issues that led to his death, but then also making something which helps us look into the future with a sense of hope and a sense of joy. And we're not allowed to talk yet about what that sculpture will look like, but we're all waiting with bated breath for the unveiling of the maquette, which will be a scaled down version of the sculpture in early next year, and then the final piece, which will be launched in 2023.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. But I can't say much about it now, but you get the idea. Yeah, absolutely.
And so Yinka, I'm going to pass over now onto our audience, who I know will have many questions for you. They'll be read out by Rachel Rich, and I'd just like to thank you for speaking to me and being so generous in your answers. It was a real delight.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Yinka. That was fascinating, and it's such a pleasure for me to be able to be the one to pass on the questions from our audience. And audience, just a quick reminder, you can see on the screen right now, I'm sure that lots of people have questions, and a few have started to roll in already. But if you do have a question for Yinka about his life, his work, his contribution to the Leeds landscape that's forthcoming, you will be able to ask them on the Slido. So you can see the details here on the screen. It's slido.com and it's hashtag YS for Yinka Shonibare -BHM for Black History Month. But Yinka, let me begin with the first question. And this is based on something you said early on in your talk, when you mentioned that you had been urged as a student to make so-called African art. And the question is whether you think that young artists are still experiencing these kinds of, well, it just says, do you think young artists might still experience this? And do you have any advice for young artists who are maybe being pigeonholed in that way?
I mean, I think, as an artist, you have to be true to yourself, and you don't need to listen to that kind of nonsense. You have to kind of do what you want to do and what you feel is true to yourself. And, I know it can be difficult, especially for young people, because they don't have the confidence to be able to stand their own ground. But I think that it's important to do something that you feel is true to yourself.
Yeah, I think that's good advice for young and old people, in fact. So thank you for that. I think we have a lot of art students at Leeds Beckett who probably want to hear your advice. Okay, the next question is about, this is about the upcoming sculpture in Leeds, which I know you've already said you don't want to give away too many details, so I don't know if you'll want to answer this question, but for people who are familiar with your work, will there be motifs or themes in the David Olawale sculpture that you're making in Leeds that people will recognize? Are you, I guess, we want to know, are you working in similar themes and motifs here?
Well, I mean, I think that, well, put it this way, I'm doing it my own way.
That's all you're going to say.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, I think, speaking maybe on behalf of most people in Leeds, we're very excited about it. The next question is, how do you feel about Black History Month becoming a campaign and less about the people from history? So that's an interesting question since we're here for Black History Month. So it says, how do you feel about Black History Month becoming a campaign and less about the people?
I'm not entirely sure what that means, because I think the people are the campaign, and the campaign is the people.
Yeah,
so, I mean, your shared existence is a campaign. If I show up, my skin color is already a campaign. If I show up anywhere, I'm a campaign. If I open my mouth, I'm a campaign. My accent is a campaign. Everything about me is a campaign.
I think that's a great answer, by the way. What a great, yeah. I think we should put that on a t-shirt. Thanks. Okay, the next question says, I was very interested in your use of batik fabric and using it to reference authenticity. Could you talk a little bit about this with regards to Mayflower all flowers?
Oh, somebody knows my work there.
Yeah.
Well, Mayflower all flowers. So that's a print I made with the boat, the Mayflower, that most people will be aware of. The Mayflower took apparently took the first migrants to the United States. And, but it's not a symbol that necessarily represents the diversity of America. And so that's why, and then I changed the sails to the textiles, the pattern in the print. And then I called it Mayflower All Flowers. So meaning, the United States of all of the diversity of America represented in, then using the Mayflower as that representation of the diversity of the United States.
Wow. Okay, the next question is about your heritage. In fact, it says, as a man of Yoruba heritage, does Yoruba culture influence your art practice? And if so, could you comment on how?
Yeah, actually, is it still possible to show slides to go back to the Royal Academy and the Ife?
I think we may be able to do that. It'll come up, I think. Yeah. Here are the slides. I think it's a treat for the audience to get to see these slides scrolling through anyway.
Yeah, stop. Yeah,
here we are.
Go back, go forward. Yeah, that's it. So, I mean, this is a sculpture that's now in the Royal Academy. The head is actually a bronze piece called Ife head, which is a Yoruba region of Nigeria. And so the body is a sculpture by Donatello. Now, when in the 60s, an American anthropologist discovered, quote unquote, the bronzes that were made in the 15th century in Ife, in Nigeria. And he suggested that Africans would never have made that Donatello, the Italian Renaissance artist, would have made that bronze head. And so as a joke, I combined Donatello's sculpture with the batik patterns printed on it. And so it's called Unintended Sculpture, Donatello's David and Ife head. Now, Ife is from it's a Yoruba region in Nigeria. Wow. So that's an example where I've made reference to the Yoruba region. It's
amazing, and you've got, your works are very humorous and so serious at the same time. It's just remarkable. Okay, I'll ask you another question that's come in. As an artist, how do you approach the research that goes into commissioning, to commissions like the David Olawale sculpture? So, for example, do you use archives the way a historian would when you're researching for a piece like that?
Yes, I mean, I used to do a lot of research, but I have a bigger studio now, and I'm working on so many artworks at the same time. So I do have research assistants who actually, because I could be working on about 10 projects. What I do is I think about my idea, and then I think about what I want to know more about. And then I tend to use history a lot in my work, so it's a combination of doing further research, historical research, and sometimes it's to do with texts, other texts that might relate to the thing that I'm thinking about. And then, I'm provided with all the research material to read. And then the second stage is image research, because there might be images that I want to use. So then my researchers will go and look for images. And then following the image research will then be my own design of the work. And then there was a time when I used to paint, where, and I just made everything myself. But now, I have various fabricators in my studio. So I have design meetings with my production manager. and also the team of fabricators. So based on my design, we discuss, what needs to be made. And then at different stages in the making, in the fabrication, the works are presented to me and I change what I need to change. And, so I follow the different stages of fabrication until we finish the works. So that's more or less how my studio is set up. So my studio is more or less like an architect's office. So I have various people working there.
It's fascinating to hear about the stages of the process, and I think that history students will be as interested as art students in hearing about that research process that goes on behind the scenes. Our next question from an audience member is whether you would be interested in doing work in or for other cities that have colonial ties. So I don't know if this is someone from another city who might be getting in touch.
Well, I mean, I think that it always depends on what it is. I don't say yes to all the projects because that's not possible, but, and then the first stage is just approach my studio, go online, and then, and then my studio will, approach, if it's something we're interested in, then we get the galleries involved, and then we have a joint meeting with myself and the galleries.
Interesting. So there's a process and people can engage with you if they're interested in that. The next audience member asks whether please can you talk a bit more about the idea of ornamentation, in particular, the idea that decorative work was often seen as bad taste or culturally low?
Well, that's one of my favorite subjects. So there's an essay called Ornament and Crime, written by, gosh, I'm showing my age, I can't remember, Adolf Loos or something. Anyway, so historically, ornamentation has always been seen as lowly work, made by artisans, and it's craft, and it's not important. And particularly with the advent of modern art, so certain forms of art have been elevated to high art, and anything sort of crafted or handmade or stitched or designed was considered not as important. There's also a level of discrimination, I think, which relates to women's work. Anything that's sort of decorative is considered women's work. And so there's a kind of class snobbery involved in this as well. So it's actually very, very political for me to actually embrace all of that. And the show that I've curated at the Royal Academy, called Reclaiming Magic, in that exhibition, I show many examples of works in textiles, stitching, knitting, and some fine pieces of artwork, by the way. So if you ever get a chance, pop into the Royal Academy and see the summer exhibition, and you'll see many ways in which I've, curated that show.
Wow, yeah, I hope a lot of people in our audience will also be able to make it to London to see that show. I'll go on to the next question. How do you feel about the high value of your work as a luxury item due to your success as an artist, with your work's exploration of social and wealth divide? Oh, this is a very interesting one, isn't it?
Well, I'd say what I say to that is just, take the money and run while you can. I think I don't have a problem with money. I think that there's a kind of fallacy that we minorities shouldn't get rich, or we should be poor. And I think I should get my fellow artists, they get remunerated in the same way. So no one's ever going to ask Damien Hirst or Jeff Koons whether they have a problem with being remunerated properly. I'm like any other professional. I'm experienced, and I have a large studio to feed, and I've got salaries to pay. So, I need some cash in the bank. So I have, I provide a lot of employment for a lot of people, so, and that I need to make that work. So if you're an artist, you need to be business savvy, and you need to understand enterprise, because you will not be able to make the next work if you don't understand how to make money. So, you need a warm place, and you need a bit of nice holidays. And, but that does not necessarily mean that I'm not a political campaigner, or I'm not an activist. I remain politically astute, but I think economic power is also political power. So, people make some cash.
Yeah, I think that's good advice, but also I think it's interesting because I think a lot of times we romanticize the idea of the starving artist, but you've sort of conveyed the idea that you're also doing a job. You have a studio, you have people who you work alongside or who work for you. So, you're not a starving artist, you're a working artist. Okay. Since we have time for a couple more questions, I'm going to ask you this one. Are there any artists, projects, or exhibitions coming up this season that you would recommend other people seeing? So things maybe that you're looking forward to, either of your own work or beyond that?
Gosh, I'd say check the gallery guide. I think I've been, because I just came out of curating the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition with about nearly 1,400 pieces of work. So with a lot of research to go with that. So I'm afraid I've been head in the sand a little bit, but anyway, there's Frieze coming up, Frieze Art Fair in London. I'm going to be very much going to that and enjoying Frieze Art Fair and looking at the various works. And there are many, many galleries all around the country that you can enjoy. But Frieze, I think, is the one that I'm going to be doing immediately.
Sounds great. Although I think your recommendation for your show or your curated show at the Royal Academy is the best recommendation you can give us. Okay, we have time for one more question, so I'm going to ask this one, which I think might be from a student here. It says that students in the School of Cultural Studies produced a website that retells David Olawale's story. How do you see the next generation reworking narratives of cities like Leeds?
Well, I think that history is very important, and I think, awareness is extremely important. And that's how you make a future. If you understand your past, you can then make a future. So I think that just keep yourself informed and educated. Even the things that you don't like, you should know about them.
Thank you so much, Yinka. It's been such an inspirational afternoon, and I'm sure that the audience would agree with me in that. So I really just want to thank you so much for making the time to be our keynote speaker for Black History Month this year. Obviously, I want to thank my colleague, Emily Zobel Marshall, who's been organizing not only this event, but actually has been organizing our Black History Month events for many years now and always does a wonderful job. And I wanted to thank the whole team behind the scenes here at Leeds Beckett who have produced this event to a really high standard, which means that Emily and I and Yinka can just focus on the content. And thank you, audience, for all your wonderful questions, which have really contributed to the success of the afternoon. So thank you, everyone.